Picture the vast, unbroken grasslands of the Central Asian steppe.
Just endless horizons.
Right, it's the early 14th century, and there is this profound, almost endless silence out there. But deep underground, in the dark, intricate burrows of marmots and gerbils, there is a microscopic event happening.
A completely invisible event.
Exactly. A single flea bites a rodent. The flea struggles to swallow. It regurgitates a tiny droplet of blood back into the animal. And, well, that's it.
Yeah, there's no explosion.
No warning siren, no dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Yet that completely silent, invisible moment is the ignition spark for the single most devastating demographic catastrophe in human history.
It really challenges our modern perception of how a civilization-altering event begins, doesn't it?
It really does. We always look for the big stuff.
Right. We are conditioned to look for the marching armies or, meteor strikes, collapsing fault lines. But the architect of the medieval apocalypse didn't carry a sword. It was a bacterium. And you're completely right to start in that rodent burrow, because to truly comprehend the scale of the Black Death, we have to kind of divorce ourselves from the European cities for a moment.
Just step away from the castles and kings.
Yeah, and look at the biological mechanics that allowed this pathogen to travel thousands of miles before anyone even knew existed.
Which is exactly what we're going to do today. So welcome to another deep dive into the sources you've shared with us. We are taking you on this very visceral chronological journey.
Tracking this microscopic killer.
Yes, tracking it from those quiet Asian steppes all the way to the bustling, doomed ports of Europe. But we aren't just looking at this from a bird's eye view, focusing on the popes and kings.
Because that only tells half the story.
Exactly. We are going to get down into the mud. We want to look at this through the eyes of the commoners.
The everyday people.
The people who faced unimaginable isolation, staggering death tolls, and the complete and utter collapse of every medical and spiritual safety net they had ever relied on.
Because if you want to understand the modern world you inhabit right now, how your economy works, how public health is structured, even the genetic makeup of your own immune system, you have to understand how this specific pathogen shattered the 14th century.
It really rebuilt society from the ground up.
It forced an entirely new society to be built on top of the graveyard. It is, without a doubt, the definitive dividing line in human history.
So let's get right into the biology of it, because the sources paint a picture of a natural cycle that is, it's elegant, but incredibly brutal. We are talking about the bacterium Yersinia pestis.
Right.
Out on the steppe, it wasn't destroying the world. It was just quietly circulating among the burrowing rodents.
Yeah, it was just an endemic cycle. The bacteria didn't particularly want to kill everything. A parasite that instantly kills all its hosts is a failed parasite.
It runs out of food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yersinia pestis had established an equilibrium with the marmots, ground squirrels, and gerbils of the region. But to move from host to host, the bacterium relied on an accomplice.
It couldn't just walk over to the next marmot.
No, it couldn't move on its own. It needed a vector. And that vector was the oriental rat flea, known scientifically as Xenopsilla chiopus.
And I found the mechanics of what happens inside that flea to be just pure body horror.
Oh, it's gruesome.
It really is. When the flea bites an infected rodent, it drinks the blood, taking the bacteria into its own digestive tract. But the bacteria don't just sit there. They begin to multiply at a terrifying exponential rate inside the flea's gut.
They multiply until they form what biologists call a biofilm.
A biofilm.
Yeah, it's this thick, sticky, gel-like mass of bacteria. And this biofilm forms right at the proventriculus, which is essentially the valve connecting the flea's throat to its stomach.
Okay, so it plugs it up.
The bacteria completely pack this valve shut.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. To put it in mechanical terms, it's like a fuel line being totally clogged with sludge.
That's a great way to put it.
The engine is running. It desperately needs fuel, but nothing can get through. So the flea is suddenly starving to death no matter how much blood it drinks.
And that starvation drives the insect completely mad. A normal flea feeds, gets full, and rests.
Right.
But a blocked flea is insatiable. It begins biting frantically, leaping from host to host, trying desperately to get a meal. But because the stomach valve is blocked by that gelatinous mass of bacteria, the blood it drinks just hits a wall.
It physically cannot swallow.
Exactly.
And here is the terrifying part from the sources. As the blood hits that blockage, it mixes with millions of Yersinia pestis bacteria.
Right.
The flea, frantic and starving, instinctively recoils and regurgitates that contaminated blood slurry straight back into the open bite wound of whatever it just bit.
It's just injecting it right back in.
It has become a microscopic flying zombie, is starving to death, but actively injecting this incredibly lethal pathogen into a new host with every single bite.
And then the host dies.
The host dies, the body cools, the starving flea realizes the blood is no longer pumping, and it abandons ship to find the next warm body.
It's just a flawless transmission mechanism. But for centuries, as we noted, this cycle just smoldered beneath the earth.
It stayed in the burrows.
Yeah, it was completely irrelevant to human history. So the crucial question the sources address is, well, what changed?
Right.
Why did this localized subterranean cycle suddenly explode across the globe in the 1330s and 1340s?
Because fleas don't walk across continents.
No, they don't.
The sources point to two massive interlocking global forces that disrupted this fragile equilibrium. The first is a profound shift in the global climate.
We often forget how entirely at the mercy of the weather our ancestors were.
We take it for granted today.
We really do. The world had been enjoying something called the medieval warm period. This was centuries of relatively stable, warm climate that allowed populations to boom and agriculture to thrive.
But that was ending.
Yeah, by the early 1300s, that era was violently ending. The global climate was entering a phase we now call the Little Ice Age.
And Ice Age makes it sound like this gentle, gradual cooling, but on the ground in Central Asia, it meant chaotic, violent weather extremes.
Continual chaos.
You had years of prolonged, scorching droughts, immediately followed by years of torrential flooding.
Which is absolutely devastating to the local ecosystem. I mean, the vegetation dies off. The rodent populations, which rely on that vegetation, experience massive die-offs and are forced to migrate in search of food.
And when the marmots and gerbils start dying in droves, those starving, blocked fleas suddenly lose their traditional hosts.
They get desperate.
They're desperate. They're no longer discriminating about what they bite. If a camel, a horse, or a human hunter seeking marmot pelts walks by, the fleas will leap onto them.
And those human hunters and camels bring us to the second massive force, human trade networks.
The spark and the kindling.
Exactly. If climate change was the spark that pushed the plague out of the burrows, the Mongol Empire provided the dry kindling to spread it across the world.
The sources mention the Pax Mongolica.
Right, the Mongol piece. The geopolitical reality of the 14th century is dominated by this. The Mongol Empire had conquered a vast swath of the Eurasian landmass.
An insanely huge area.
And while their conquests were incredibly brutal, the aftermath was a unified, heavily policed, and highly efficient trade network. They had created an unprecedented superhighway connecting the East and the West.
I was reading about their postal and relay system in the sources, the YAM. It's mind-blowing.
It really was ahead of its time.
They had relay stations set up a day's ride apart across the entire continent, constantly stocked with fresh horses and supplies.
A merchant or a messenger with the right imperial passport could travel at speeds that wouldn't be matched again until the invention of the railroad.
And this is where the sources you provided correct a very common historical misconception.
Oh, about the Silk Road.
Yeah. Older textbooks often say the plague traveled west along the traditional Silk Road via camel caravans bringing spices and silk to Christian merchants.
Right, that's what everyone learns in school.
But the historical records show that by the 1340s, the direct overland Silk Road trade with Christian Europe had actually been severely restricted or even closed off due to political tensions. The plague didn't primarily move on silk.
It moved on grain.
Exactly, it moved on grain.
Which makes so much more sense biologically. It traveled via the commercial networks of the Golden Horde, which was a northwestern sector of the Mongol Empire.
Moving steadily toward the lower Volga region and the Black Sea.
Traveling at the speed of trade, hidden in massive sacks of grain. And where you have grain shipments, you inevitably have rats.
Specifically, the black rat, Rattus rattus.
Yes.
This is a nimble, climbing rat that loves to nest in cargo, in the holds of ships, and in the roofs of human dwellings. It's the perfect vehicle.
So if we pull back and look at the whole picture, you have this incredibly lethal bacteria.
Multiplying inside a starving, frantic flea,
Which is riding on the back of a black rat.
which is nestled comfortably inside a sack of grain,
Moving steadily along the most efficient commercial superhighway the world had ever seen.
heading directly toward a European population that has absolutely zero genetic immunity.
It is a slow-motion catastrophe unspooling in the dark, which brings the pathogen to a very specific geographical bottleneck in the year 1346, the city of Kaffa.
Kaffa, which is modern-day Feodosia on the Crimean Peninsula.
Right.
This place is fascinating in the sources. It was this glittering, heavily fortified trading hub, but it wasn't controlled by the locals.
No, it was a colony.
A colony of the Genoese Republic. The merchants of Genoa had built this massive fortress to act as the primary funnel sucking the wealth of the East into the Mediterranean.
It was a vital economic artery, but in 1346, that artery is severed.
Because Kaffa is under heavy siege.
Right, by the Mongol army of the Golden Horde, led by a Khan named Janibeg.
So the Genoese are trapped behind their massive walls, but they have the sea at their back so they can keep getting supplied by ships.
And the Mongols are camped outside, unable to breach the fortifications.
It's a grinding, miserable, brutal stalemate until the invisible killer finally catches up to the Mongol camp.
The historical accounts from the siege describe the Mongol war machine simply dissolving from the inside out.
Just melting away.
Soldiers who reported for morning muster perfectly healthy were dead in their tents by nightfall, their bodies covered in terrifying black swellings.
Imagine being Janibeg. You are commanding one of the most feared armies on Earth. You are trying to break this Italian fortress, and your army is suddenly vaporizing before your eyes.
He must have been terrified.
In a moment of pure, spiteful terror and frustration, he makes a decision that has gone down in history. He orders his engineers to load the swollen, blackened, rotting corpses of his own plague-ridden soldiers into the massive trebuchets.
And he catapults them over the walls into the city of Kaffa.
It is frequently cited by military historians as one of the very first recorded acts of biological warfare.
We actually have the account of Gabriel de Mussis.
The Italian notary.
Yes, who compiled testimonies from survivors. He described the visceral horror of the defenders watching the great soaring arcs of their dead enemies flying over the battlements and smashing into the streets and houses.
But I have to pause here, though, because looking at the biology we just discussed, I have a logistical question about the sources.
Sure.
Did catapulting those bodies actually cause the outbreak inside Kaffa? The people inside the city thought the horrible smell, the rotting flesh, was poisoning them.
Because of the miasma theory.
Right. But we know they didn't understand germ theory. Can you actually catch the plague just from a flying corpse?
It's an excellent question to raise because the medieval perception and the biological reality are completely at odds here.
Okay.
The physical and psychological terror of raining corpses on a city is undeniable. It absolutely shattered the morale of the Genoese. But a dead body on its own is actually a very poor transmitter of bubonic plague.
Wait, really?
Yeah, you cannot catch the bubonic form just by smelling a rotting corpse.
Because the bacteria need to get into your bloodstream.
Precisely. The true weapons that Janibeg launched over the walls were the invisible passengers on those corpses.
The fleas.
Think back to the starving flea. The fleas and the rats that were clinging to the clothing and hair of those dead Mongol soldiers didn't care about the dead flesh.
Right, the blood isn't pumping anymore.
The moment the bodies landed inside Kaffa and began to cool, the ravenous fleas abandoned them. They hopped off the corpses, scuttled into the shadows of the city, found the local black rats, and infiltrated the Genoese population.
Oh, wow.
The Genoese thought the stench of death was killing them, but it was actually the frantic, biting insects multiplying in their grain stores.
It's the ultimate microscopic Trojan horse.
It really is.
So panic completely erupts inside Kaffa. The Genoese merchants realize the siege is basically irrelevant now. The walls are useless. The city itself is dying.
They have to get out.
They scramble down to the docks, pack whatever cargo and families they can onto their sleek trading galleys, and abandon the city. They row out into the Black Sea, desperate to flee through the Mediterranean and get back to the safety of Italy and Sicily.
They believed they were outrunning the apocalypse.
But they were bringing it with them.
They didn't realize they had just become its primary delivery mechanism.
You really have to put yourself in the shoes of one of those sailors to grasp the horror of this voyage. The sources talk about this path from the Silk Road to the ports.
It must have been a living hell.
You are on a Genoese galley.
Mm-hmm.
It is incredibly cramped. You are packed shoulder to shoulder with sailors, traumatized refugees, expensive cargo.
And hidden in the dark, the infected black rats.
Right. You think you've escaped the nightmare of the siege? You are breathing sea air. But a few days into the voyage, A sailor at the oars develops a sudden, violent fever.
And then he complains of an agonizing pain in his armpit.
Within hours, the swelling appears.
And the cramped confines of a medieval ship are the absolute worst place to be during an outbreak.
There's nowhere to go.
There is nowhere to run, nowhere to isolate. The fleas move easily from person to person in the damp, dark holds.
The sources describe men dying at their oars. The survivors on these ships must have slowly realized the horrifying truth of their situation.
They hadn't run away from the sickness.
They had sealed themselves inside a wooden box with it, surrounded by an ocean they couldn't drink. It is highly likely that many of these galleys simply became ghost ships.
Just drifting aimlessly with entirely dead crews until they eventually smashed into coastal rocks or broke apart in storms.
But the absolute tragedy for Europe is that a dozen of these spectral galleys actually survived the crossing.
In October of 1347.
Yes, October 1347. A small fleet of Genoese ships drifts silently into the port of Messina on the island of Sicily.
The harbor master rows out to greet them, probably expecting news from the east and rich cargo.
Instead, he climbs aboard and finds the decks literally littered with the dead and the dying.
The stench is overpowering.
The one who are still alive have grotesque swellings on their bodies. The Sicilian authorities realize instantly that this isn't normal ship fever. This is heavy pestilence.
So they immediately order the ships to turn around and go back out to sea.
But it doesn't matter.
No, it's too late.
The ships were only moored to the docks for a few hours. That is all the time the Black Rats needed. Before the galleys were pushed back out to sea, the rats had scurried down the mooring ropes, scampered across the stone docks, and melted into the shadows of Messina.
The beachhead was established.
The pathogen had successfully crossed the water. The killer has arrived.
And now Europe is in the crosshairs.
Before we track how it tears through the continent and look at those staggering death tolls, we need to understand exactly what it did to the human body. Because once the Yersinia pestis bacterium jumped from the flea to a human, the sources detail that it manifested in 3 distinct, horrific forms.
Let's break them down, starting with the most common, the bubonic form.
This is the one everyone thinks of.
This is the classic presentation. When an infected flea bites a human, it injects the bacteria into the skin. The bacteria then travel through the human lymphatic system, heading toward the nearest lymph node.
The lymph nodes are supposed to be the body's defense mechanism, right? They're supposed to trap infection.
They are. But the plague bacteria multiply so aggressively that the body's defense mechanism becomes a trap. The infected lymph node swells with grotesque speed.
It becomes an agonizing, rock-hard lump called a bubo.
Exactly.
The sources describe these buboes growing to the size of an egg or even a small apple.
And they usually occur closest to where the flea bit you, so in the groin, the armpit, or the neck.
The swelling is accompanied by a violent, shaking fever, and the bacteria begin releasing toxins that cause internal bleeding,
Resulting in dark, purplish bruises under the skin.
hence the name, the Black Death.
Right. For someone contracting the bubonic form in the 14th century, the mortality rate hovered around 60%.
60%. Just brutal odds.
If the bubo naturally burst and drained the pus, there was a small chance of survival, but the pain was indescribable.
Then you have the second form, the septicemic form.
This form is much faster and far more lethal.
How does it work?
Well, in this presentation, either from a massive initial dose of bacteria or the failure of the lymph nodes to contain the infection, the bacteria bypass the lymphatic system entirely.
So they don't even go to the nodes.
Right. They multiply freely directly in the bloodstream.
So the body's defenses are completely overrun from the very first second.
Exactly.
The toxins flood the bloodstream, causing systemic shock and uncontrollable internal bleeding. The extremities, the fingers, toes, and nose literally darken, turn necrotic, and die from a lack of circulation while the person is still alive.
The septicemic form was incredibly swift. People could contract it in the morning and be dead by the evening.
And the mortality rate.
Practically 100%.
Unbelievable. But it's the third form that elevated this outbreak from a severe epidemic to an apocalyptic event.
The pneumonic plague.
This is the one that chilled me to the bone while reading the sources. If the plague infection manages to reach the lungs of a victim, everything about how the disease operates changes.
It no longer needs a rat.
It no longer needs a flea.
It breaks the vector chain entirely. The bacteria adapt to the lung tissue. The victim develops a deep, bloody cough, and with every cough they are expelling an aerosolized spray of pure Yersinia pestis bacteria into the air.
If you are standing in the same room as someone with pneumonic plague and you inhale those microscopic droplets, you contract primary pneumonic plague.
The bacteria go straight into your lungs.
It destroys the respiratory system from the inside out essentially drowning the victim in their own blood. It kills in less than 48 hours.
The mortality rate is as close to absolute 100% as any disease in human history.
It turned every crowded room, every church, every family home into a death trap.
Now, take that incredibly contagious aerosolized pneumonic form and combine it with the flea-driven bubonic form, and look at the environment it just walked into.
The medieval city.
The medieval European city was essentially a perfectly engineered urban tinderbox waiting for a spark.
All right, let's talk about that environment. Because we romanticize the medieval era, knights, castles, cobblestones. But the reality of a medieval city like Paris or London in the 1340s was a biological nightmare.
It was filthy.
You have incredibly narrow, winding streets. The houses were built with jetties, upper stories that overhung the street below,
In some alleys, the houses on opposite sides almost touched at the top.
completely blocking out the sun and keeping the air at street level stagnant and damp.
And step inside those houses. The floors, especially for the commoners, weren't clean wood or stone,
They were typically covered in rushes or straw.
and this straw was rarely changed. It accumulated food scraps, dirt, and moisture. It was a perfect, warm, insulated nesting ground for fleas.
And outside wasn't any better. The concept of public sanitation simply did not exist. There were no sewer systems.
None whatsoever. When people needed to empty their chamber pots, or throw away rotting vegetables, or dispose of animal offal from the butchers, they simply opened their windows and tossed it directly into the street.
Sometimes they'd give a quick shout of "Gardez-l'eau" from the French "Gardez-l'eau." Watch out for the water before dumping human waste onto the heads of pedestrians below.
The streets were basically open, muddy cloacas. It smelled horrifying, even on a good day.
For the Black Rat, this wasn't a human city. It was a 5-star, all-you-can-eat buffet. They lived in the thatched roofs of the houses, dropping their feces directly into the living spaces, scurrying across the rafters, mere inches away from sleeping human families.
The microscopic barrier that we have today between the animal world and the human world simply did not exist.
So when the plague hit Messina in late 1347 and then spread to the mainland, it didn't just cause an outbreak.
It exploded.
It didn't behave like any sickness the authorities had ever seen. It moved like a supernatural curse.
And from Sicily, the sources allow us to track its terrifying chronological march.
It utilized the liquid highways of the Mediterranean.
Terrified people fleeing Messina carried it on ships to the great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa by January of 1348.
From Italy, it sweeps up into the southern French port of Marseille. It travels up the Rhone River, hitting the papal city of Avignon, and then surges north to Paris.
By the summer of 1348, it reaches England, entering through the southern port of Weymouth.
And then by 1349, it crosses the North Sea again on a ghost ship full of wool where the crew had all died and crashes into Bergen, Norway.
The speed is staggering, and the death tolls. The sheer mathematics of the devastation are almost impossible for the modern human mind to grasp.
We aren't talking about losing 1 or 2% of a population.
We are talking about entire societies being halved.
The sources provided some very specific numbers that we need to emphasize here. Take Paris. At the time, it was one of the most densely populated, vibrant cities in Europe.
Right.
At the peak of the outbreak there, Paris was losing an estimated 800 people every single day.
800 a day. The civic infrastructure to handle the dead completely collapsed within weeks.
In Florence, the population was reduced from over 100,000 to roughly 50,000.
Half the city gone.
In London, the local churchyards filled up so instantly that the authorities had to urgently purchase land outside the city walls to dig massive industrial-scale plague pits.
And across Europe as a whole.
From the Mediterranean up to Scandinavia, modern historians estimate that the Black Death killed roughly 60% of the entire population.
I want to pause on that number. 60%.
It's hard to even picture.
It's a statistic that loses its meaning if you just read it on a page. Imagine walking down your own street today, looking at the houses of your neighbors and realizing that 6 out of every 10 houses are permanently empty.
Just gone.
The people inside are gone, the economic output is gone, the institutional knowledge is gone.
Which brings us to the profound psychological breakdown of the everyday commoner. I mean, how do you process a tragedy of that magnitude when you don't even know what a bacterium is?
You can't. You look for meaning where there is none.
We have a first-hand account from the Florentine chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the nightmare of 1348 and wrote about it in the introduction to his famous work, the Decameron.
He doesn't just list statistics.
No, he writes about the absolute dissolution of the social contract.
He observed a society totally unraveling under the weight of unrelenting fear. He noted that the laws of both God and man just ceased to function because the magistrates and the priests were either dead, dying, or hiding.
There was no one left to enforce order.
Boccaccio describes how the sheer terror of contagion severed the deepest human bonds.
He writes that brother abandoned brother, uncles abandoned nephews, wives abandoned husbands.
But the detail that truly haunts the historical record is when he describes the breakdown of the family unit.
Yes, he highlights the most unnatural act of all, the thing that shows the true depth of the horror. Mothers and fathers refusing to nurse or even assist their own sick children.
It's just unthinkable today.
They would look at their child, see the dark swellings appearing on their neck, and the parental instinct would just break. They would lock the door to the child's room and flee the house to save themselves.
Imagine the terror.
Think about the profound isolation of that moment for the victims. To be a child, burning with a violent fever, dying completely alone in a silent, empty house with absolutely no medical refuge.
And the only sound is the rats skittering in the thatched roof above you.
The primal, instinctual love of a parent simply evaporated in the face of this invisible terror.
It forces us to ask, how do people cope with that level of existential dread?
When everyone around you is dying and there is no cure, how do you behave?
Boccaccio noted that society essentially fractured into extreme survival strategies.
Right, because there's no middle ground anymore. You had one group, let's call them the hedonists.
The partiers.
They looked around, saw that the pious and the wicked were dying at the exact same rate, and decided the world was ending anyway. Why follow the rules?
They broke into the empty, opulent villas of dead nobles.
They drank the finest wines heavily, threw debauched parties, and engaged in whatever carnal pleasures they wanted. It was a frantic, hysterical dance on the very edge of the abyss.
Then you had the exact opposite reaction, the hermits.
The isolationists.
These were people who believed they could exert some small measure of control by creating a tiny bubble of perfect order. They locked themselves away in their homes, refusing to see anyone.
They ate only the most delicate, easily digestible foods.
They drank fine wine, but in extreme moderation. They played music softly and absolutely refused to listen to any news of the outside world.
No death tolls, no rumors, just total psychological walled gardens.
And for the people who still had to walk the streets to find food or do their jobs, they carried scented flowers or sponges soaked in vinegar or aromatic herbs, holding them constantly to their noses.
They were desperate to ward off the bad air they believed was carrying the sickness.
But regardless of whether you partied, prayed, or hid, the bodies kept piling up, which created a massive, terrifying logistical nightmare for the cities.
Boccaccio mentions that the traditional rites of death, the wakes, the weeping relatives, the solemn procession to the churchyard, were abandoned entirely.
There was no room left in the consecrated ground.
So the cities resorted to mass graves, the plague pits. At night, the streets were roamed by men known in Italy as the bacchini.
These were often criminals, or the absolute poorest, most destitute men who had nothing left to lose.
They were paid exorbitant wages to do the unthinkable. They would roam the darkened streets with wooden carts, crying out for the living to bring out their dead.
Surviving families would literally drag the naked bodies of their loved ones out to the doorstep and leave them in the mud.
And the bacchini would pile them onto the carts like cordwood.
Boccaccio has a stark, brutal phrase for how the bodies were buried. In London, archaeologists excavated the massive East Smithfield plague pit and found exactly what he described.
People were laid tightly together in massive trenches and then covered with a thin layer of dirt, and then another layer of bodies was placed on top. Boccaccio wrote they were layered like lasagna with cheese.
It is the complete and utter erasure of the individual.
In death, you were no longer a father, a baker, or a noble.
You are stripped of all identity, all dignity, and reduced to a layer of organic material in a trench.
And while this apocalyptic scenario is playing out street by street, we have to ask, where was the medical establishment?
Oh, they were completely lost.
Let's transition to the total failure of medieval medicine, because this was a society that found itself entirely without a medical refuge.
The learned physicians of Europe, the men who had studied at the great universities in Paris and Bologna, reached for the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years.
They relied heavily on the classical medical systems developed by Hippocrates and Galen.
But they found this knowledge completely, hopelessly useless against Yersinia pestis.
Let's explain the logic they were operating under, because it wasn't just random guessing. They had a very rigid framework called the system of the four humors.
Yes. The humoral theory posited that the human body was governed by 4 distinct fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
And these humors corresponded to the four elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and to temperatures, being hot, cold, wet, or dry.
Health meant these four humors were in perfect, harmonious balance.
And sickness meant an imbalance. So if you had a fever, they believed your body had an excess of blood, which was hot and wet.
Exactly. And alongside this humoral theory, they deeply believed in the theory of miasma.
The bad air.
This was the idea that disease wasn't caused by microorganisms, a concept they couldn't even imagine, but by corrupt, pestilential air.
They thought a poisonous vapor rising from stagnant swamps or unburied corpses, or even caused by the unfortunate alignment of the planets, was the actual physical killer.
You inhaled the bad air, it corrupted your humors, and you die.
And we have to give them a little bit of grace here because from their perspective, the miasma theory was entirely logical.
They could literally smell death everywhere.
The air in these cities did smell like rotting corpses in open sewers.
That's a great point. It's like a deadly smoke alarm analogy.
Right. Because the air smelled horrible during the plague, they logically mistook the symptom, the terrible smell of death, for the underlying cause.
It's like seeing a house on fire, hearing the smoke alarm blaring, and concluding that the loud noise of the alarm is what's causing the flames.
They thought if they could just fix the smell, they could cure the disease.
Which led to some incredibly desperate and often highly counterproductive public health measures and cures.
The cities tried to cleanse the atmosphere. They lit massive, roaring bonfires in the public squares, burning aromatic woods like pine and cedar to burn away the miasma.
The Pope at the time, Clement VI, actually survived the terrifying summer of 1348 in Avignon by using this exact method.
Yes, his doctors advised him to isolate himself in his private chambers and sit between two roaring fires day and night through the blazing heat of a French summer.
Which sounds like torture, but is completely wild because it accidentally worked.
It actually worked.
The doctors thought the fire was purifying the miasma, but what it was actually doing was creating a blazing hot, dry microclimate in his room.
And fleas hate heat.
Fleas are highly sensitive to heat and desiccation. The extreme heat of the fires physically kept the infected fleas away from the Pope.
He survived based on a totally flawed premise.
But the commoners couldn't afford to sit between two fires all day.
No. The advice for them was simpler: hold a cloth soaked in vinegar to your face when you walk outside.
Yeah.
Or sniff a pomander ball stuffed with spices.
But what happens when you actually get sick? When the bubo appears?
The treatments the doctors prescribed for the buboes were agonizing. Because they believed the plague was a hot and wet disease caused by a corruption of the blood humor, their immediate, most common response was bloodletting.
They would take a lancet, literally open a vein in the patient's arm or neck, and drain their blood into a bowl until the patient physically fainted.
They were taking people who were already exhausted, fighting a violent fever and internal bleeding, and intentionally draining their vital life force away.
It undoubtedly killed patients faster.
If that didn't work, they would focus on the bubo itself. They believed the swelling was the body desperately trying to push the toxic humors to the extremities.
So they would try to draw it out. They would lance the agonizing bubo with a sharp, unsterilized blade to release the pus and then apply poultices.
And these weren't soothing aloe vera poultices. They were applying blistering mixtures of tree resin, lily root, and frequently dried human excrement, packing it directly into the open bleeding wound.
And there was another incredibly bizarre treatment that gained popularity based on the idea of sympathetic magic or drawing out poisons.
The pigeon method.
Yeah.
This is grim. They would take a live pigeon, slice its belly open, and press the warm, bleeding flesh of the bird directly onto the patient's bubo.
The medical logic was that the pigeon's natural heat would somehow act as a vacuum and draw out the venom from the human into its own body.
And if you were wealthy, you had access to even more exotic, utterly useless cures.
Like drinking potions made of crushed emeralds suspended in liquid.
Or a concoction called theriac, which was an incredibly expensive aged jam made from dozens of ingredients, the primary one being the roasted flesh of vipers.
Crushed emeralds and snake jam.
And unsurprisingly, none of it did absolutely anything. We have a stark clinical account from a man named Guy de Chauliac in the sources.
He was the Pope's personal physician in Avignon, one of the most educated medical minds in Europe.
Chauliac is a fascinating figure because he observed the plague with a truly scientific eye. He was the one who accurately identified the difference between the bubonic form, which he noted you could sometimes survive, and the pneumonic form, which he noted killed everyone within days.
But despite his brilliance, he admitted utter humiliating defeat.
He had nothing.
In his writings, he confessed that the medical profession was completely useless. He wrote that doctors were terrified. They dared not visit the sick out of fear of infection, and on the rare occasions they did go, they could do absolutely nothing to heal them.
Chauliac himself actually contracted the plague. He developed a bubo and lingered near death for weeks. He survived, but he was remarkably honest about it.
He attributed his survival entirely to the grace of God, not to any of his own medical knowledge.
He wrote a line that perfectly captures the helplessness of the era. I, to avoid infamy, dared not upset myself, but with continual fear I preserved myself as best I could.
With continual fear. It was an admission by the greatest medical authority of the age that they were powerless.
Medical establishment had essentially abandoned the populace. So put yourself in the shoes of a frightened medieval commoner. When the doctors throw their hands up and admit defeat, where do you go?
You go to the cathedral,
You turn to the only other authority you have left, the church.
which ushers in a profound, earth-shattering crisis of faith. You have to remember the absolute centrality of the Catholic Church in the medieval mind.
It governed everything.
Everything from the calendar to the laws to the eternal fate of your soul. And the overwhelming, universally accepted belief, from the lowest peasant to the King of France, was that the Black Death was Flagellum Day.
The scourge of God.
They believed this wasn't a biological event. It was a divine punishment. God was pouring out his wrath to punish the vanity, the greed, and the sins of mankind, much like the biblical flood.
But here is where the psychological breaking point occurs. The church offered no protection. The plague was totally, terrifyingly indiscriminate.
It killed the devout, cloistered nun who spent her entire life in prayer just as easily and just as agonizingly as it killed the corrupt, wealthy merchant who cheated the poor.
It struck down priests right at the altar while they were elevating the host. Parishes held massive, desperate processions. Masses were sung day and night in plague-choked cathedrals.
And the prayers were met with absolute silence. The bodies kept piling up.
The institutional damage to the church was catastrophic, starting with sheer demographics. The mortality rate among the clergy was shockingly high.
Because many of the good priests actually did their duty.
They didn't flee.
Right. They stayed in the cities to hear confessions, administer the last rites, and comfort the dying. But by leaning in close to hear the whispered confessions of plague victims, they were constantly exposing themselves to the highly contagious pneumonic form.
In some dioceses in England and France, the mortality rate for the clergy hit a staggering 70%.
The church lost a massive percentage of its most dedicated, educated, and pious servants.
And to fill that sudden, massive vacuum, bishops panicked. They desperately needed priests to perform the sacraments, so they were forced to ordain men who were entirely unqualified.
They rushed illiterate men who only wanted the stable income of the church, men with little moral authority into the priesthood.
The commoners saw this. The great spiritual fortress of medieval life was being hollowed out and replaced by opportunists. It permanently damaged the institution's prestige.
And nature abhors a vacuum. Into this terrifying space of spiritual silence, unanswered prayers, and failing priests stepped a radical movement, the Flagellants.
The Flagellants. This is where the sheer desperation of the era becomes highly visible.
These were massive processions of laymen, sometimes hundreds or thousands strong, marching from town to town across Europe.
They would enter a town square, form a large circle, strip down to the waist, and begin rhythmically whipping themselves.
And they weren't using simple willow branches. They used heavy leather scourges, often with 3 or more tails, and each leather tail was knotted and embedded with sharp iron spikes.
They would beat their own shoulders and backs until they were a bloody pulp. And they did this according to a very strict ritual.
They would march and whip themselves for exactly 33.5 days one day to represent each year of Jesus Christ's life on earth.
They followed strict rules. No bathing, no changing clothes, no talking to women.
The theology behind it was desperate but clear. They believed that the official prayers of the church had failed, so they were taking the burden upon themselves.
They were attempting to mimic the suffering of Christ, to offer their own blood in agony to appease an angry God and convince him to lift the plague from humanity.
For the terrified townsfolk watching this, the Flagellants must have looked like the only hope left.
The priests were dying or hiding, but these men were bleeding for them. The crowds treated them like living saints, dipping cloths in the Flagellants' blood as holy relics.
But we have to look at how the institutional church viewed this. To Pope Clement VI, sitting in Avignon, the Flagellants were a massive existential threat.
Because they were bypassing the priests.
Exactly. The flagellants developed their own theology. They claimed that their bloody rituals could wash away all sin.
They were essentially saying to the populace, you don't need a priest to be saved. You don't need the sacraments of the church. We have a direct line to God's mercy.
It was open heresy that struck at the very foundational authority of the Catholic Church.
Plus, from a purely epidemiological standpoint, the flagellants were a disaster.
Oh, absolutely.
You had massive crowds of bleeding people moving from an infected town, gathering huge crowds of locals together in a tight circle, and then moving on to a clean town.
They were a perfect, highly mobile mechanism for spreading the plague.
Pope Clement VI recognized both the theological and the physical danger quickly. In 1349, he issued a papal bull formally condemning the flagellants as heretics and ordering secular authorities, the kings and dukes, to suppress the movement.
Without the support of the church and facing arrest by secular armies, the flagellant movement burned out relatively fast.
But the underlying terror didn't burn out. The sky was still silent. The doctors were still helpless.
And when the heavens offer no solace and the earth offers no cure, the terrified human mind does what it tragically often does in times of incomprehensible crisis. It searches for a human scapegoat.
It is a devastating historical reality that when faced with an invisible, highly abstract threat like a microscopic pathogen, a panicked society will desperately manufacture a visible one.
Fear requires a face. The society demanded a conspiracy, a tangible enemy that could be confronted, punished, and destroyed. They wanted an active man, not the inscrutable will of God.
Because you can fight an active man, you can't fight the air.
In the social landscape of 14th century Europe, the Jewish population had long been marginalized. They lived in segregated quarters, were restricted from many professions, and were subjected to centuries of deep-seated religious prejudice.
In this moment of ultimate societal panic, they became the canvas onto which a terrified Christian majority projected its absolute darkest fears.
A monstrous conspiracy theory started as a quiet rumor in southern France and Spain and then spread like a wildfire across the continent. The Jewish population was accused of causing the Black Death by intentionally poisoning the communal wells and springs.
The specifics of the rumor are so absurd it highlights the madness of the time. The conspiracy claimed there was an international plot directed by Jewish leaders in Spain to distribute small leather pouches filled with a deadly concoction.
And this poison was allegedly made of pulverized spiders, frogs, owls, and the stolen hearts of Christians.
It was a narrative that required a complete and total suspension of logic. Anyone with eyes could see that Jewish communities were being devastated by the plague at the exact same time, and at the exact same staggering mortality rates as their Christian neighbors.
In fact, because they were often forced to live in highly cramped, walled-off ghettos, their mortality rates were sometimes even higher.
But in the grip of mass hysteria, logic is the first casualty. Blaming the Jewish population gave the terrified masses a sense of agency. It gave them someone to strike back at.
It is important to note that the highest authorities tried to stop this. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 explicitly defending the Jews.
He stated clearly that they were entirely innocent of the well poisoning charges. He used basic logic, pointing out that the plague was ravaging places where no Jews lived and that Jews themselves were dying of the pestilence.
He threatened excommunication for any Christian who assaulted them or seized their property.
But the Pope's decrees were essentially ignored. In the face of local panic, deeply ingrained prejudice, and naked economic greed, the words of Avignon meant nothing.
Because we must acknowledge the economic motive here. Many of the massacres were not just mob violence. They were highly methodical, organized by local trade guilds, nobles, and town councils who saw a brutal opportunity to cancel the massive debts they owed to Jewish moneylenders by simply murdering their creditors.
And as we go through this, I want to emphasize that as hosts, we're just imparting what the historical sources state without taking any sides on modern issues. We're just looking at how fear turned people into active participants in mass slaughter.
The historical sources detail the horrific scale and efficiency of this violence. In September 1348, at Chillon Castle on the shores of Lake Geneva, the authorities arrested several Jewish individuals.
They were subjected to horrific torture on the rack until they finally broke and gave forced confessions to poisoning the wells.
Those tortured confessions were transcribed, stamped with official seals, and circulated to other cities as legally sanctioned proof of the conspiracy. They acted as a continent-wide death warrant.
In Basel, Switzerland, the city council responded to mob pressure by herding hundreds of Jewish citizens into a specially constructed wooden building on an island in the Rhine River and burning the building to the ground with them inside.
The massacre in Strasbourg is particularly chilling because of its sheer, cold, bureaucratic efficiency. This wasn't a spontaneous riot.
On Valentine's Day in 1349, before the plague had even officially reached the city walls, the city government ordered the arrest of the entire Jewish community, nearly 2,000 men, women, and children.
They were marched to their own cemetery where a massive wooden platform had been constructed. They were offered the choice of forced baptism or death. The vast majority refused. They were burned alive.
Their property was systematically inventoried and divided up by the town council, and all records of financial debts owed to them were collected and physically destroyed.
A few weeks later, the Black Death arrived in Strasbourg anyway, oblivious to the slaughter.
In Mainz, one of the largest and oldest Jewish communities in Europe, a massive force of citizens exterminated an estimated 6,000 people. It is a deeply chilling testament to how extreme fear can warp the human mind.
They eliminated the imaginary poisoners, but the actual poison was in the fleas on the rats in their own roofs.
The wells remained poisoned not by human hands, but by a world that had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. Which brings us to the aftermath.
By late 1351, the great terrifying wave of the initial Black Death finally begins to recede. It burns itself out, having run out of vulnerable hosts.
The survivors slowly creep out of their homes, taking down the boarded-up windows, and step out into a world that is eerily, terrifyingly empty.
In many regions, fewer than half the people who were alive and working in 1347 were still there to harvest the crops in 1351. The silence in the countryside must have been deafening.
So we have to look at what this massive demographic vacuum means for the society that was left behind. Because while the tragedy was immeasurable, the massive drop in population completely flipped the medieval economy on its head.
For 1,000 years prior to this, the European economy was structured around the feudal system. This was an agrarian system that relied on two fundamental pillars: an absolute abundance of cheap peasant labor and a strict scarcity of land.
The lords owned all the land. The serfs were legally tied to that land, forced to work it for the lord in exchange for meager protection and a small slice of the harvest. The lord had all the leverage.
But suddenly the math changed entirely. The plague killed indiscriminately, wiping out the labor pool. Suddenly, land was everywhere.
There were empty farms, empty villages, unplowed fields stretching to the horizon. But labor was incredibly scarce.
A powerful lord might own 10,000 acres of prime agricultural land, but if he has no peasants left alive to plow it, sow it, and harvest it, that land is completely worthless. His wealth is rotting on the stalk.
And for the first time in history, the peasant realizes something revolutionary. They have leverage. If a serf doesn't like how his lord is treating him, he doesn't have to stay.
He can simply pack his meager belongings in the middle of the night, walk away from his ancestral manor, and go to the neighboring lord's estate.
Because that neighboring lord is desperate. His crops are rotting too. He is willing to ignore the feudal laws. He will offer the runaway peasant double or triple the old wages, paid in clean, hard cash, with better living conditions and no oppressive feudal obligations.
It was a massive upward transfer of wealth and negotiating power to the lower classes.
The ruling elite were absolutely horrified. To the nobility, the social hierarchy wasn't just an economic system. It was divinely ordained by God. The idea of a peasant demanding higher wages was seen as an offense against the natural order.
So the governments tried to legislate the economy back in time.
The prime example is in England. In 1351, King Edward III enacted the Statute of Laborers. This law was a desperate attempt by the nobility to stop the bleeding. It explicitly tried to freeze peasant wages at exact pre-plague 1346 levels.
Furthermore, it made it a literal crime for a peasant to leave his master's land to seek better pay elsewhere, and a crime for a lord to offer higher wages.
But you cannot outlaw the fundamental laws of supply and demand. The law was completely unenforceable. Landlords secretly paid the higher wages anyway under the table, just to ensure they didn't go bankrupt.
The primary effect of the Statute of Laborers wasn't fixing the economy. It was breeding immense, boiling resentment among the lower classes.
The peasants had tasted economic freedom, and the lords were trying to drag them back into servitude. That friction builds for a few decades until it violently explodes in the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381.
You have figures like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball leading tens of thousands of armed peasants marching directly on London, capturing the Tower of London, and demanding the king formally end serfdom forever.
Now, the revolt itself was ultimately crushed, and the leaders were executed. But the underlying message lingered, and the economic reality was undeniable. The old manorial economy was dead.
The nobles shifted from labor-intensive grain farming to sheep farming, which required far fewer hands. The Black Death accelerated the total collapse of serfdom in Western Europe.
It paved the way for social mobility, waged labor, modern capitalism, and eventually the accumulation of wealth that would fund the artistic explosion of the Renaissance.
And speaking of art, the culture shifted massively too. The psychological trauma of the plague left a permanent scar on the European mind. Before the plague, religious art was mostly serene, gilded, heavenly. It focused on salvation and the majesty of God.
After the plague, the art becomes intensely, almost grotesquely obsessed with the grave, with decay, with worms.
This is the birth of the artistic motif known as the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. You see it painted on cemetery walls, in churches, and in manuscripts.
It's a very stark, highly democratic imagery. It depicts a grinning, animated skeleton representing death, leading a long chain of people into the grave. But it's who's in the chain that matters.
You see the skeleton grabbing the hand of a pope in his full regalia, next to an emperor with his crown, next to a wealthy merchant with his purse of gold, right down to the poorest, ragged peasant.
It was a deeply subversive, dark comfort to the commoner who had lost everything. It was a visual reminder that your wealth, your earthly power, your piety, your expensive doctors, none of it could buy you a reprieve from the pit.
Death was the ultimate, inescapable equalizer. Beneath the velvet robes and the dirty rags, everyone was just a fragile collection of bones waiting for the music to stop.
But humanity didn't just resign itself to death forever. The plague didn't vanish in 1351. It returned in a second wave in the 1360s, and then kept returning every 10 to 20 years for centuries.
But the response to it slowly shifted. When prayer and flagellation failed, humanity started to learn how to fight back using policy and observation. We see the messy, terrifying, but vital birth of public health.
Cities realized they couldn't cure the disease, but they could restrict its movement. In 1377, the Mediterranean city-state of Ragusa, which is modern-day Dubrovnik in Croatia, pioneered a remarkably simple, effective idea.
They mandated that any ship arriving from a plague-suspected region had to anchor offshore and isolate its crew and cargo for 30 days before anyone could disembark. They called this a Trentino.
And later, the great naval power of Venice adopted this, but extended the waiting period to 40 days. In the Venetian dialect, 40 days is quarantino, which gives us our modern English word quarantine.
We also see the rise of powerful municipal health boards. These secular magistrates were given extraordinary emergency powers. They could shut down markets, lock families inside their homes, burn infected goods.
And build massive plague hospitals called lazarettos on isolated islands to forcibly separate the sick from the healthy.
And this era gives us the most iconic, terrifying image of the disease, the plague doctor. You know the image, the long black leather coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and that grotesque bird-like mask with the long beak?
It's important to note that the plague doctor uniform didn't become standardized until the 17th century, but the concept is rooted in this post-Black Death medical adaptation.
Right. And the mask wasn't designed to look scary. It was highly functional based on their flawed science. The long beak was stuffed tight with aromatic herbs, spices, dried flowers, and camphor.
Because they still believed in the miasma theory that bad air caused the plague, they thought the beak would act as a filter, purifying the poisonous air before it reached their nose.
The heavy leather coat was often coated in wax, which, entirely by accident, created a slippery surface that prevented the plague-carrying fleas from latching onto them.
The doctors carried a long wooden cane so they could examine patients, take a pulse, or remove clothing without physically touching the infected person.
While their foundational theory of bad air was totally flawed, these doctors and health boards represented a massive leap forward. It was the first organized secular attempt by the state to manage a massive public health crisis using borders, armed guards, forced isolation, and data collection via death records.
It was the beginning of the state taking responsibility for the physical health of the population, stepping into the void left by the church and classical medicine.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today, tracing a path of unimaginable destruction.
To summarize the journey we've been on, Yersinia pestis started as a silent bacterium blocking the stomach valve of a starving flea on the Central Asian steppe. Propelled by the climate chaos of the Little Ice Age and the vast commercial network of the Mongol trade routes, it hitched a ride on the black rat to the gates of Europe.
There, it found an entirely defenseless population living in a perfectly designed, highly unsanitary urban tinderbox.
It wiped out roughly 60% of the European population in a matter of years. It shattered the absolute moral grip and prestige of the medieval church. It radically dismantled the economic chains of the feudal system, giving the peasant class their first taste of leverage and freedom.
And it forced a terrified humanity to abandon classical superstitions and invent the very concept of organized public health.
It was the ultimate invisible architect of the modern European world. Before we sign off, though, I know you have one final insight from the sources, a connection to the modern day that completely blew my mind when I read it.
Yes. I want to leave you with one final mind-bending fact to mull over, one that shows just how long the shadow of the 14th century truly is. The Black Death wasn't just a historical event. It was the greatest, most brutal, selective pressure event in human evolutionary history. It was a terrifying experiment in the survival of the fittest.
Because 60% died, but 40% lived. Why did they live?
Some of it was luck, isolation, or good health. But geneticists have discovered that a small fraction of the people who survived the plague happened to possess a very specific random genetic mutation. It is known today as the CCR5 delta 32 mutation.
What exactly does that mutation do in the body?
It's a small deletion in a gene that codes for a specific receptor protein located on the surface of your white blood cells. This protein acts like a doorway, a docking port for certain pathogens to enter the cell and infect the body. Because the people with this specific mutation survived the plague, while their neighbors without it died, they lived to have children and they passed that mutation on. Over centuries of recurring plague outbreaks acting as an evolutionary filter, this genetic scar became unusually common in the European population.
And why do modern scientists care about a medieval doorway on a white blood cell?
Because today, scientists know that this exact same cellular doorway, the CCR5 protein, is the primary receptor that the HIV virus uses to enter and infect human immune cells.
Wow.
If you have 2 copies of the CCR5 delta 32 mutation today, your cellular doorway is essentially locked. The HIV virus cannot get in. You are functionally immune to HIV. By suffering through and surviving the absolute nightmare of the Black Death, those medieval commoners inadvertently bequeathed to their modern descendants a powerful genetic shield against one of the deadliest viruses of the modern era.
That is absolutely incredible. It shows how history isn't just a list of dates in a dusty book. The shadows of the 14th century, the legacy of those silent, terrifying nights Boccaccio wrote about literally still flow in our bloodstream today. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive into the sources. We started by looking at a silent event in a rodent burrow, an invisible killer hidden inside a sack of grain. We hope this journey has shown you just how loud the echoes of that silence truly are. Keep exploring, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.